Groudon vs Kyogre. There are no other pairs of box art legendaries that represent a greater rivalry. Sure, there are other box art mascots that display a great concept of polar opposites, but Groudon and Kyogre represent something that feels so indescribably primal, if you will. And I think you can see it in the way fans talk about these two. Ruby and Sapphire were released in North America in 2003, and I still see people taking sides and really taking pride in their preferred box art legendary. And you don't really see that with the other games. And I think it's a lot more interesting than people realize, both from a meta fandom perspective and of course within the actual Pokemon canon. So, first off, this was partially inspired by a recent little social media war that happened between fans of the game a few months back. It was after an artist posted some fan art of each mon that got a lot of attention. Now, this little war was all good and fun. No one was actually taking it seriously. But it really hits me how this isn't really done with any other box art pairing. The closest was red and blue. But that sparked debates about your starter of choice. Not just between Charizard and Blastoise were cooler. It also didn't matter which version you got when it came to those Pokemon choices. You could just get Pokemon Red and choose Blastoise anyway. With Ruby and Sapphire, the box art Pokemon was the one you were confronted with in that version's story. The two versions have a bit more of a further departure from each other, with two different villain teams and such, so you may have felt a stronger connection to the version you played, where it wasn't as big of a deal with something like Diamond and Pearl or Gold and Silver. To hammer this point in a bit more, try to think of how different the story of X and Y are because of the legendaries you encounter. Not very different at all, despite those mascots being opposite themes of life and death. It's not an inherently bad thing, but it does make the legendary and villain team aspect of Hoenn a bit more unique. Now, I don't want to make the two different teams in the Hoenn games just seem like shallow associations with the legendaries either. While the team's goals seem a little ridiculous or radical, they were clearly inspired by a real-life reclamation project in Japan that was and still is pretty controversial. Maybe one day we'll be able to talk more about the more substantial themes of Hoenn, but this video isn't that. This is about the hype. Yeah, I know that sounds really surface level, but I think it needs to be talked about because it's something that's actually endured for over 20 years. Firstly, I think a big part of the impressions fans got from these two legendaries was the fact that you had to encounter one of them in Ruby or Sapphire, since Pokemon Crystal was a third version released really late into the Game Boy Color's life cycle, on top of having limited marketing compared to other games in the series. It only ended up selling 6 million. Yeah, I know, only 6 million is still a number other games would kill for, but it's a far cry from Ruby and Sapphire's 16 million or so. So most fans from the time had their first experience being confronted by a big bad legendary as a part of the plot in Gen 3. It was a pretty big deal, especially with the legendary battle music. It was a really new vibe from this series even if you faced off with Suicune in Crystal. And because of this impression, a lot of people become big fans of the legendaries they encountered, which again depended on the version you had. It almost never fails when you ask someone which of the two they prefer between Kyogre and Groudon, and they'll just make their choice based on whether they had Ruby or Sapphire. Now, personally, you can't go wrong with either. Both of these legendaries are absolute aura farmers, and are genuinely terrifying for different reasons. What's interesting is that neither Pokemon seem to be inherently violent. Pokédex entries confirm this, and they even helped people through difficult times. Now, I don't know if that means the Pokemon are outright docile around humans in these previous generations, or if it's more incidental. Either way, it's clearly just supposed to be a metaphor for humans and Pokemon coexisting in a way that benefits each other, which connects to the themes of how humanity interacts with other species and the environment. So everyone at recess or the college campus or whatever had their preferences in 2003. People were Groudon stans or Kyogre stans. But then Emerald comes along, and you get to see these two beasts confront each other in this version of the game's story. And it was a pretty monumental moment. In Pokemon up to this point, you didn't really ever see this level of a potential world-ending moment. Groudon and Kyogre just facing off had the potential to destroy the planet. It really showed us just how powerful and terrifying these legendaries are. I think in Kyogre's case, the scary part is really hammered in. Because while Groudon looks a bit more like a typical kaiju monster, Kyogre is very recognizably a whale even with the very stylized design. And something about that feels scarier, because it represents the deep sea in a clear way. And the deep sea is something that will always feel slightly foreign and frightening to us. Like, the ocean is just kinda scary sometimes when you realize how off limits and mysterious it is in the real world. So, something about Kyogre can just feel a bit eerie. Groudon, on the other hand, has a more traditional badass demeanor. I think as a Pokemon, its design is a bit easier to look at and immediately think, wow, that looks really cool. Plus the fact that it's got a typing weakness to Kyogre, but the fact that it's still portrayed as equal in a one-on-one fight just gives it this fearless impression that's tough to match. Now, again, their face-off was an Emerald, the third version. This came out in May of 2005 in North America, quite a while after its September 2004 Japanese release. The internet was more common at this point, and was making its cultural footprint. And a lot of Pokemon fans were already very online with constant rumors and theories. So even before this was released in America, we could still see screenshots of this scene being posted from the Japanese version. And it kind of reignited the fanboys of each legendaries. Seeing the Titans share the screen brought back a bit of the Hoenn hype after it died down a little bit about a year after release. It helped that Emerald differentiated itself more than Crystal did as a third version, so more people may have been willing to double dip on another version of the Hoenn games, since 2 whole years had passed since the release of Ruby and Sapphire, myself included, because Emerald is one of my favorite games. While Kyogre and Groudon are the real rivalry here, we need to talk about our third man, Rayquaza. This Pokemon is supposed to be the answer to the rivalry, stopping them when they confront each other, and having an ability that stops their own weather-altering abilities. Symbolically, it works pretty well, since Rayquaza sits high in the sky, high above the mountains and oceans of the region. It also has a 10 more base stat total than both of them, sort of giving it a minor superiority in gameplay numbers. This is more symbolic than anything, as it's always felt like the three of them were somewhat equal in lore. But that Rayquaza is a bad matchup for them in universe due to some very specific conditions. Kind of like how Wolverine has a real hard time against Magneto no matter what because of his metal bones. This makes Rayquaza feel like it exists outside of the rivalry itself. However, it doesn't take away from the trio itself. I'd actually argue these three together are the best legendary trio in the entire series. They're clearly terrifyingly powerful, but still very rooted in familiar concepts of nature and not too abstract like the creation legendaries in Sinnoh. I also just think the simple color spread of red, green, and blue work for these elements too. I don't know, man. They were just cooking with these three. It's also really cool that this trio are the main legendaries. They're not like the bird trio or the beasts from Johto. They're the big boys with massive stat totals. And yeah, Ho-Oh and Lugia were also those types of legendaries. But not only are they not a trio, but they also don't have that much of a connection to each other. They essentially have their own separate mythology. Whereas Groudon and Kyogre are not only very connected, but they act like they really hate each other. And that's the other thing. While you might think that their aggression toward each other is nature and instinct and nothing more, I just don't entirely buy it, since we know each of the Pokemon are peaceful otherwise, and have even helped people and just kind of do their own thing. It's difficult to buy that it's just instinct. Yes, instinct must be a part of it. They're opposites. But my point is, they're not mindless. They still keep happiness and friendship mechanics if you want to count that as well. It's canon that they could be used by a trainer. So, because of all these other factors, it really does feel like there is a personal hatred there, even if it's not actually real hate and just 100% of their nature. It feels like there's something more when they interact with each other. If you've seen the anime adaptations of their primal forms battling, it just feels so raw, excessive, and violent. Again, either way, this dynamic is what makes them as a pairing so interesting from a fan point of view, because inevitably, you're gonna take sides with the version you bought. And 20 years later, it feels like people still buy into the hype of their personal favorite between the two. Talking about Kyogre could never match Groudon's aura or whatever. Just constant back and forth, like it's the Yankees and the Red Sox, or the Dodgers and the Padres. And that's kinda awesome. It gives the two Pokemon maybe a bit more playful character just through fan interaction. And ultimately, that's the reason it's the best Pokemon rivalry. At the time of Ruby and Sapphire's release, it made you have a bias and pick one over the other in terms of favoritism. And looking at some of the recent back and forths on social media, it's cool to see that people clearly support their favorite in good fun. And you know what? I think this series kind of needs to do something like this at the same level again. They've had opposing duos, obviously, but never one like this again. If box art Pokemon are still going to be legendary pairings, then I think we need two that are truly opposing each other. Two that make you think there must be some kind of beef that makes you want to bet on one Pokemon over the other. Can you imagine a Groudon Kyogre type pairing, or even the market for the game plays them up as true opposing forces? Asking players which version they'll choose, whose side are you on? I don't know. I think it'd be really harmless fun. But yeah, that's why I think this is the greatest Pokemon rivalry. Now, before you close the tab, you gotta answer my question in the comment section. Groudon or Kyogre? You can like both. Most people do. I am personally more of a Kyogre fan, but I like Rayquaza the most, and I think a lot of people do too. But you can only choose one, so if I had to choose one, I'd pick Kyogre. I'm also curious as to why. Did you pick a version back in the day just because maybe you liked the way one of the legendaries looked? Or do you like one of them because of your personal team building or something? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below.